Imagine a scenario that sounds, I don't know, like a Hollywood thriller, but it's actually playing out right now in real time.
Right, literally as we speak.
Exactly. So the U.S. military executes this flawless, totally unprecedented amphibious assault. Marines hit the beaches of this heavily fortified island in the Persian Gulf.
And they secure the target, they capture the oil terminals.
Right. The mission is hailed as a total tactical success. But then, just a week later, the entire war effort just, well, it grinds to a sudden, catastrophic halt.
And not because of enemy fire.
No, not because of a counterattack or bad military strategy. It halts because the Pentagon's checks literally bounce.
Yeah, the U.S. government runs out of money to pay for the occupation.
Because the bond market collapses overnight.
It's the ultimate paradox of modern warfare. I mean, the military can win the battle on the ground, but if the financial system crumbles underneath them, the victory just evaporates instantly.
Welcome back to EPIC. That stands for Economic Power and International Conflict. And today, we are bringing you the second installment of our EPIC Deep Dive.
And for those of you tracking the calendar with us, it is exactly April 2, 2026.
Yes, April 2, 2026.
It's an incredibly important date to plant a flag on, honestly, considering just how fast the ground is moving underneath us right now. We are at a true inflection point.
We really are. Now, to ground you in where we are, if you joined us for the first part of this deep dive, we explored a very specific, somewhat chilling thesis.
A hidden logic.
Right. We looked at the underlying hidden logic of the entire Iran crisis. The core argument we examined was that the escalating conflict in the Persian Gulf was never genuinely about nuclear non-proliferation.
No, and it was never truly about regional containment or, human rights either.
Exactly. Instead, it was described in our sources as this highly choreographed blueprint, a strategic maneuver designed from the ground up to completely restructure global energy trade.
And crucially, to forcefully mandate the redenomination of oil in U.S. dollars.
The preservation of the petrodollar, plain and simple.
Yeah, it's basically the use of a geopolitical crisis as a blunt instrument for American economic survival.
Right. But, in that first installment, we were essentially looking at a theory, a projection of what might happen. The mission of today's deep dive is to confront that theory with hard, cold reality.
Because the sequence of events has played out perfectly.
It has. Over the last 10 months, the predictions have unfolded with almost mechanical precision. But, as we're going to see today, a massive hidden variable has essentially hijacked the steering wheel.
It has completely accelerated the entire timeline.
Yeah. So, okay, let's unpack this. Because what we're looking at right now is a real-time race between a military offensive in the Persian Gulf and a ticking time bomb in the U.S. bond market.
And that race, it's moving from a marathon pace to an absolute sprint. To understand why this is happening today, on April 2, 2026, we have to look at the scorecard.
Right. We need to measure the predictions against reality.
Exactly. We need to measure what we analyzed previously against the reality that has actually played out since last summer.
Let's do exactly that. Let's pull up the timeline, starting back in June 2025. The prediction was that the administration would deliberately reaffirm its objective to reduce Iranian oil exports to absolute zero.
Right.
And that this aggressive posture would precipitate what was called the 12-day war, starting around June 12th.
And that is exactly what happened.
Yeah.
The narrative emerged perfectly on schedule. The 12-day war wasn't just some random escalation.
It was planned.
It was the opening bell of a much larger campaign. Immediately following that 12-day window, we saw Iranian exports begin a steep, very deliberate decline.
Yeah, the pressure was being systematically applied.
Exactly. They were testing the waters for the broader economic siege.
Which naturally led to the events of September 2025. Prediction for September was for these comprehensive snapback sanctions.
Right. And again, reality confirmed the theory. The sanctions hit Iran's banking sector, their energy sector, their maritime shipping.
But I want to pause here because there is a detail in the source data that really caught my eye, and I think it fundamentally shifts how you have to look at this whole conflict.
The surgical nature of the sanctions.
Yes. The sanctions were incredibly surgical. They completely spared the physical oil infrastructure itself.
Yeah, and that detail is, it's the skeleton key to understanding the entire grand strategy.
How so?
Well, think about the history of warfare. In a conventional conflict aimed at destroying an adversary's economic engine, you obliterate the infrastructure. You crater the runways.
You level the refineries.
Exactly. You sink the loading terminals. You make it physically impossible for them to produce or export anything. But the September 2025 sanctions deliberately ring-fenced the oil jetties and the petrochemical facilities on Kharq Island.
I was thinking about this while going through the notes, and it really reminds me of a hostile corporate takeover in the business world.
Oh, that's a good way to look at it.
Right, because if you want to put a rival out of business completely, you burn down their factory. You destroy their means of production.
But if your goal is to take over their market share,
Right. If you want to absorb their revenue for yourself, you don't burn the factory.
right.
You fire their security guards, you lock out their executive management, but you keep the assembly line completely intact. Is that what we're seeing here on a geopolitical scale?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, that analogy is perfectly aligned with the facts on the ground. But let's take that analogy one step further.
Okay.
You don't just keep the assembly line intact. You force the customers to buy the product using your own company script. The target is not the destruction of Iranian oil.
It's the appropriation of it.
Absolute appropriation. The United States needs that oil to continue flowing to global markets to prevent a catastrophic price spike.
Which would cripple Western economies.
Exactly. But it needs that oil to flow strictly under U.S. control, and crucially, priced exclusively in U.S. dollars.
Okay, so that perfectly tees up a massive milestone on our scorecard, February 2026. This is the date of the Supreme Court ruling regarding the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEEPA.
And we really need to spend some serious time here.
Yes, because the interpretation of this ruling is where a lot of casual observers get entirely tripped up.
They absolutely do. This is a critical point of correction that we need to clarify for you right now. The mainstream headlines completely missed the underlying macroeconomic implications of this legal maneuver.
Yeah, let's clear this up. Originally, Trade Representative Jamieson Greer had a strategy involving these broad IEPA tariffs. Now, if you just skim the news, you might think the administration was hoping the Supreme Court would give him a green light to use these massive sweeping tariffs forever as a weapon.
Right.
But the justices signaled deep legal skepticism. They effectively signaled a rejection of those broad, permanent IEPA tariffs. Now, at first glance, that looks like a massive defeat for the administration, right?
It does look like a defeat on the surface.
But the sources suggest that this rejection isn't a failure of the administration's broader goal. It's actually the very catalyst for the military action we are seeing right now. I need you to explain this. How does a legal setback on trade tariffs translate into an amphibious assault in the Middle East?
It is all about the plumbing of the global financial system. Let's break down exactly why broad tariffs matter.
Oh.
Historically, why does the U.S. use broad tariffs? Most people think it's just about protecting domestic manufacturing, keeping jobs at home, right?
Yeah, that's the standard political talking point.
But on a macroeconomic scale, broad tariffs serve a much more vital hidden purpose. They structurally force other nations to hold massive amounts of U.S. dollar reserves.
Because they have to offset their trade deficits with the United States.
Exactly. It's a mechanism that forces the world to demand and hold dollars. It provides a massive stability function for the U.S. currency.
So the tariffs act as a kind of artificial gravity. They kept the dollar at the center of the global financial solar system because everyone is forced to hold them just to balance their ledgers.
Precisely. That artificial gravity is essential. Now, look at the new current tariffs being used by the administration right now.
The temporary ones.
Right. They are strictly limited in time, and they aren't bound by previous bilateral agreements. They are just temporary patches. So when the Supreme Court's February 20th ruling made it clear that the broad, permanent IEPA tariff strategy was legally doomed,
That artificial gravity suddenly disappeared.
it vanished. The administration realized in that moment that they were losing their primary peaceful mechanism to force global dollar reserves.
Wow. So if you can't force the world to hold dollars through trade tariffs, and you know the court is going to block you, you have to find another way to force the world to hold dollars.
You have to replace that stability function immediately. Think of the stakes here. If nations don't need dollars to manage trade deficits with the U.S., they will dump their dollar reserves.
And the value of the dollar collapses.
Completely. This Supreme Court ruling essentially pushed the administrations back against the wall. They had to execute a reliable alternative.
Then what's the alternative?
The only viable alternative, large enough to absorb that much global capital, is the aggressive reinforcement of the petrodollar by physically curtailing oil trades happening in other currencies.
I see. The ripple effects of that legal decision didn't stop in the courts, though. It spilled directly into the Persian Gulf.
It had to. The timing wasn't a coincidence.
Right, because right as the legal pathway for the tariffs was closing in January and February 2026, the military pathway was blasted wide open. The U.S. deployed 2 carrier strike groups to the Middle East.
A massive show of force.
And the message was incredibly explicit. Any attempt to blockade the Strait of Hormuz would trigger direct strikes on Iranian export infrastructure, specifically focusing on Kharq Island.
And then, right on schedule, on February 28, Operation Epic Syria officially begins.
Every single phase, the 12-day war testing the waters, the surgical sanctions preserving the infrastructure, the legal maneuvering that forced their hand, and the massive military deployment.
It was a perfectly choreographed sequence.
It really was. But to truly grasp why the U.S. felt so deeply compelled to orchestrate this massive hostile takeover of Kharq Island, we have to pull the camera back even further.
Right, we have to look at what Iran was doing.
Yes. We have to look at what Iran was successfully building in the shadows while the rest of the world was distracted. Because while the U.S. was setting up its chess pieces, Iran wasn't just sitting there taking the sanctions.
Not at all. They effectively built a weaponized, non-dollar financial transit system right in the middle of the Strait of Hormuz.
They built a toll booth.
Exactly, a toll booth.
Yeah.
And because they control the geography, they decided exactly what currency that toll booth accepts.
The sources refer to it as the Swiss yuan gold transit system. It sounds like something out of a spy novel, honestly.
It really does.
But it is a dual-tier toll system operating in one of the most critical maritime choke points on the entire planet. Let's look at the actual mechanics of this because it's brilliant in a terrifying way.
Let's break it down.
So, if you are a vessel from a hostile nation, and in this specific context, Iran explicitly defines that as the US, Israel, or the UK, you are effectively blocked. You are entirely denied passage through the strait.
But if you are deemed a neutral or friendly nation, you are allowed to pass.
However, passage comes with a strict condition.
Right. A toll payment is required to traverse the waters, and here's the kicker. You cannot pay that toll in US dollars.
Wow.
Iran mandated that the settlement mechanism must be executed in Chinese yuan or in physical gold.
And it must be routed through Swiss intermediaries to bypass Western financial surveillance.
That's the Swiss part of the Swiss yuan gold system.
This is staggering. Let's look at the actual data for March 2026, because the numbers here represent a tectonic shift in global finance. As of March, Saudi Arabia is settling 41% of its oil exports to China in renminbi.
They have officially surpassed the dollar for those specific trades.
And Iran is conducting 100% of its crude oil exports to China in renminbi. Iraq has shifted over 60% of its China-bound oil to the Chinese currency.
And it's not just the yuan. The UAE and Qatar are actively developing gold-anchored settlement mechanisms using the Shanghai Gold Exchange.
We really need to pause and let those numbers sink in. These aren't rounding errors.
No, these aren't small experimental trades. These are the absolute pillars of the global energy market, systematically decoupling from the U.S. financial system.
By creating this discriminatory toll system in the Strait of Hormuz, Iran managed to accomplish what decades of traditional economic sanctions failed to do.
They weaponized physical geography to force energy importers to transact outside the dollar system.
It's a brutal ultimatum. If you want energy to keep your country running, you play by their financial rules or you face energy starvation.
Exactly.
Here's where it gets really interesting and, well, a bit ironic. Did the U.S. sanctions inadvertently act as the catalyst for the exact alternative financial system Washington was desperately trying to prevent?
It's highly likely.
By trying to squeeze Iran out of the dollar system over the last decade, did the U.S. essentially force them to build a highly efficient, parallel financial universe?
It's the classic law of unintended consequences, but, elevated to the level of grand geopolitical strategy. The U.S. assumed that locking Iran out of the SWIFT system and denying them access to the dollar would isolate them into submission.
They assumed the dollar was irreplaceable.
Right. Instead, necessity became the mother of invention. Iran, working intimately alongside China and leveraging Swiss neutrality for the complex plumbing of the transactions, proved that a non-dollar energy market isn't just a theoretical concept discussed at economic summits.
It's an active, functioning reality. It's happening right now.
Exactly. The March 2026 data we just reviewed proves that this is no longer a future threat. It is a present crisis. The petrodollar is actively collapsing.
The very mechanism that requires the world to hold U.S. dollars to buy energy is being successfully bypassed on a massive scale.
And this is the exact, unvarnished reason why the U.S. has targeted Kharq Island. They aren't just taking a piece of land.
They are attempting to physically seize the spigot so they can violently mandate that the oil flowing out of it is strictly denominated in dollars again.
They are trying to smash the yuan gold toll booth and reinstall a US dollar toll booth by force.
Wow. Okay, but here is the grim reality facing the administration, and this is where the entire plan hits a massive wall. Physically seizing the oil infrastructure is only half the battle.
Because wars cost money.
Exactly. Occupations cost money. Supplying troops on a hostile island costs money. The U.S. has to finance this entire operation, and that brings us to the very constraint that is currently choking the American strategy to death.
Right. If the military campaign is the sword, the bond market is the shield.
And right now, that shield is cracking under immense, unprecedented pressure. We need to look at the ticking clock of the Treasury market. Let's dive into the data here because it paints a very alarming picture.
The numbers coming out of the New York Federal Reserve are truly staggering.
Yeah.
Since February 25, 2026, which you'll notice is just 3 days before Operation Epic Fury officially began,
Right.
foreign central bank holdings of U.S. Treasuries held at the Fed have plunged by $82 billion.
Wait, hold on. $82 billion vanished in a matter of weeks. For you listening, can you contextualize that? Is that a normal fluctuation?
Not at all. That is a violent, systemic unwinding. And it brings the total foreign central bank holdings down to $2.7 trillion.
Which is low, right?
That is the lowest absolute level we have seen since 2012.
Right.
We are watching a 14-year low hit right as the U.S. is launching a major capital-intensive military campaign.
And to add another deeply concerning layer to that, the data shows that foreign central bank gold holdings, which currently sit at about $3.9 trillion, have officially surpassed their U.S. Treasury holdings for the first time in modern history.
The trust in the American paper is evaporating, and the global rush to the metal is on.
So the obvious question is why? Why are our allies and partners dumping American debt at the exact moment we need to finance a war? Do they suddenly hate the U.S.?
It has absolutely nothing to do with geopolitical animosity. It all comes down to a brutal mathematical economic paradox that is effectively destroying the Treasury market from the inside out.
We have to walk through the mechanics of this because it's the hidden engine driving the entire global crisis. Let's break it down for the listener. Let's take it step by step. Step one. Energy prices.
Right. When a conflict kicks off in the Middle East, particularly one involving the Strait of Hormuz, where roughly 20% of the world's oil passes, energy prices experience a massive immediate shock.
Yeah.
Oil prices spike.
Okay.
Now, because a large portion of the world still has to buy oil in dollars, these importing countries suddenly need a lot more U.S. dollars to buy the exact same amount of energy just to keep their lights on.
So high oil prices create a massive, sudden global demand for dollars. That makes the U.S. dollar stronger relative to other currencies, right?
Exactly. The dollar strengthens aggressively. But here's where the paradox becomes lethal for the United States.
Why?
When the dollar gets that strong, that fast, the domestic currencies of all these foreign nations begin to plunge in value. The euro, the yen, the won, they all start crashing against the dollar. Their domestic purchasing power collapses, which imports massive inflation into their own economies.
So if you're the Central Bank of Japan or the European Central Bank, your house is suddenly on fire. Your currency is crashing because the dollar is too strong. What do? How do you defend your currency?
You have to intervene in the currency markets. You have to artificially stabilize your plunging domestic currency. And the only way to do that is to go into your national reserves, take your highly liquid U.S. Treasury bonds, and sell them on the open market.
You sell the treasuries to raise cash, and you use that cash to buy up your own currency to prop up its value.
Exactly.
It's an economic snake eating its own tail. The stronger the dollar gets because of the military crisis, the faster our own allies and foreign partners have to dump our national debt just to survive the currency shock.
That is the perfect analogy. And here is the devastating consequence for the U.S.
Okay.
The more U.S. treasuries these foreign banks dump onto the open market, the more the price of those bonds drops due to oversupply. And in the bond market, when prices drop, yields go up.
The yield being the interest rate the U.S. government has to pay to borrow money.
Right. So as allies dump our debt, U.S. borrowing costs spike. This makes financing the U.S. debt, and critically, financing the military operation itself, astronomically expensive.
Now, I know the original analysis from the hidden logic theory predicted this paradox would happen, but looking at the sources, they are making a very sharp distinction about the timeline.
Yeah, the timeline is the scary part here.
The original theory assumed that central banks would start dumping U.S. debt after the energy prices hit their absolute peak.
And that is exactly where the reality has proven to be much more severe and immediate than the theory. This isn't a cyclical rebalancing of portfolios. It is a structural break.
The foreign central banks didn't wait.
No, they didn't wait for the energy prices to peak. They saw the military buildup in January. They saw the legal maneuvers failing in the Supreme Court. They saw the March data on de-dollarization in the Strait, and they fled preemptively.
They are dumping U.S. debt before the crisis even reaches its zenith.
They are rushing for the exits before the theater is even fully on fire.
And the truly terrifying part is that global central banks aren't the only ones acting preemptively. The Federal Reserve here in the U.S. has clearly seen the writing on the wall.
Leading to what the sources describe as the most alarming signal of the entire crisis.
This brings us to a critical development. The Fed has blinked first. According to the April 2nd situation update we have in front of us, the Federal Reserve has already begun quantitative easing, or QE.
Right.
And they are doing this not as a reaction to a market that has already crashed, but as a precaution.
To fully grasp how violently abnormal this is, we have to look at the history of the Federal Reserve.
Right, let's pause for the listener who isn't a Wall Street trader. QE is basically the Fed creating new money out of thin air to buy government bonds, right?
In simple terms, yes.
It's a way to inject massive liquidity into the financial system and artificially keep interest rates down when nobody else wants to buy the debt. But historically, they only deploy this weapon when the economy is in an absolute freefall, like during the 2008 financial crisis or the 2020 pandemic shutdowns.
Exactly.
So why is doing this early a massive red flag rather than just, smart proactive planning?
What's fascinating here is, well, the Fed simply does not pre-position quantitative easing for speculative purposes. They don't expand their massive multi-trillion-dollar balance sheet proactively unless the alternative is total systemic failure.
Wow.
By initiating precautionary QE, the Fed is essentially issuing a silent, desperate admission. The U.S. Treasury market is currently too fragile to survive the upcoming weeks of this military campaign without artificial life support.
So behind closed doors, the Fed has been briefed on the military timeline for Operation Epic Fury.
Oh, absolutely. They know exactly what's coming, they know the scope of the operation, and they've run the math.
What does the math say?
The math says the bond market will break. The foreign selling of treasuries is so aggressive, so relentless, that the Fed realizes if they don't step in as the buyer of last resort right now, today, bond yields will skyrocket out of control.
And the U.S. will face a catastrophic sovereign debt crisis right in the middle of a war.
They are furiously building a firewall before the fire even starts because they know the spark is already lit.
The strategic implications of this are staggering. Let's look at the posture this forces the United States into. On one side of the globe, they're playing intense military offense in the Persian Gulf.
Deploying troops and aircraft to seize Kharq Island.
Right, to violently force the petrodollar back into place. But simultaneously at home, they are playing desperate financial defense in the bond market.
And you cannot sustain escalation and de-escalation at the same time.
It is a total contradiction in grand strategy.
It really is. Offense requires vast amounts of capital, robust economic confidence, and the ability to absorb shocks. Defense requires retreating, lowering yields, and conserving resources.
The U.S. is trying to drive a car with the accelerator pinned to the floor while violently pulling the emergency brake.
Exactly. The sources make it abundantly clear. Because of this dynamic, the strategy's shelf life has shrunk dramatically.
We aren't talking about a military campaign that can drag on for months or years like previous Middle Eastern engagements.
No, the window of financial viability is now measured in mere days.
And with that financial window rapidly closing, we need to transition our focus to the physical battlefield. Because what happens on the ground over the next 72 hours will dictate whether that financial window slams shut permanently.
Let's examine Operation Epic Fury and the actual tactical military reality of Kharq Island as of today, April 2, 2026.
Let's look at the disposition of forces.
The preparation phase is completely over.
The sources detail the softening strikes that occurred back on March 13th. U.S. forces systematically cleared the Iranian air defenses, the radar installations, the island's airport, and an Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps naval hovercraft base.
It was a methodical dismantling of the island's defenses.
But, returning to our hostile takeover analogy from earlier, they deliberately left the oil jetties, the loading terminals, and the massive petrochemical facilities completely untouched.
They cleared out the security system, but deliberately left the vault fully intact. And now, the assault force is staged and waiting.
We are looking at a massive footprint. Approximately 7,700 deployable troops waiting for the ultimate green light. You have the 31st Marine Expeditionary Unit stationed on the USS Tripoli.
You have the 11th MEU on the USS Boxer.
And you have the 82nd Airborne Division waiting in Kuwait as a rapid reinforcement element.
It is a massive concentration of amphibious and airborne combat power. But the military analysts cited in the source material point out a terrifying geographic reality that complicates this entire operation.
What's that?
Taking Kharq Island might be relatively straightforward given that the air defenses have been suppressed and the Marines are heavily armed. But holding it, that is a completely different story.
Right, because of where it is.
Kharq Island is located a mere 25 kilometers from the Iranian mainland.
25 kilometers is nothing in modern warfare. It is a stone's throw.
It is well within range of conventional, unguided artillery, let alone precision-guided munitions or suicide drones. As the former military intelligence officers point out in the briefing, Iranian forces absolutely have every square inch of Kharq Island pre-registered for rocket artillery.
So what does this all mean for the troops on the ground? We aren't just talking about taking an island and setting up a base.
Not.
We are attempting to operate a vulnerable, highly combustible, massive oil facility inside an active shooting gallery. You have U.S. Marines and Army engineers trying to pump highly flammable crude oil into massive tankers while taking sustained counter-battery fire from a mainland they can literally see from the beach.
It is a logistical nightmare of epic proportions.
Yeah.
To survive, they will need sustained 247 air superiority just to intercept incoming fire and prevent the entire island from being leveled in a massive petrochemical explosion.
And they will need a massive continuous logistical pipeline of ships to supply the troops with food, water, and ammunition.
And to maintain the fragile oil infrastructure. And that logistical pipeline will be constantly subjected to interdiction from small boats, mines, and anti-ship missiles.
And again, to play devil's advocate, why take on this nearly impossible, highly dangerous task? Why put 7,700 American lives at risk to hold a tiny rock in the Gulf?
Right. Why not just bomb it?
Exactly. Why not just bomb the oil jetties from 30,000 feet, destroy their export capability, and walk away?
Because of the petrodollar thesis.
We have to keep reiterating this point because it is the central, unyielding logic of the entire conflict.
If they destroy the island, Iranian oil stops flowing entirely. If that happens, global oil supply drops drastically, prices go parabolic, and the de-dollarization we saw in the March data, the rush to yuan and gold, accelerates out of control as countries panic to secure whatever energy is left.
To save the dollar, they must physically hold the island. They must capture the revenue. They must control the physical volume of oil leaving the port to prevent global price spikes.
And crucially, they must force every single barrel leaving that island to be denominated and paid for in U.S. dollars.
They have to replace the yuan gold toll booth with a U.S. Treasury toll booth.
And they have to do it at gunpoint while under artillery fire.
But here is where the grand strategy encounters its most terrifying blind spot. Even if the Marines execute this operation perfectly,
Right. Even if it's flawless.
even if the Kharq assault is a military success, the artillery is silenced, and the oil starts flowing in dollars, the entire grand strategy can be instantly undone by a third party operating hundreds of miles away from the Persian Gulf.
This is the massive hidden variable we mentioned at the start of the deep dive. This is the sum of all fears scenario.
The Houthi wildcard.
Yes.
On March 31st, just 3 days ago, Houthi Deputy Information Minister Mohammed Mansour issued a very explicit, very public threat.
He stated that if the U.S. escalates against Iran and strikes Kharq, closing the Bab al-Mandeb Strait is a, quote, Yemeni option.
For you listening, let's visualize the geopolitical map for a second. The Arabian Peninsula is effectively surrounded by two massive, critical maritime choke points.
On the eastern side, you have the Strait of Hormuz, which Iran controls, and where Kharq Island is located. This is where the U.S. is focusing all its military might.
But on the western side, running down the Red Sea, you have the Bab al-Mandeb Strait, which the Houthis heavily influence from the coast of Yemen.
If the Houthis make good on this threat simultaneously with the conflict in Hormuz, you are looking at the catastrophic consequence of a dual strait closure.
Both the eastern and western exits of the Arabian Gulf would be hermetically sealed to Western shipping.
And this destroys the ultimate Western fallback plan. Over the years, Saudi Arabia has built a massive piece of infrastructure called the Yanbu Alternative.
Explain what that is.
It is a pipeline designed to move about 5 million barrels of oil a day across the entire landmass of Saudi Arabia to a port on the Red Sea, completely bypassing the Strait of Hormuz.
So it's their ultimate safety valve. If Hormuz closes due to war, they just pump the oil west across the desert and ship it out of the Red Sea to Europe and America.
Exactly. But if the Houthis close the Bab al-Mandeb Strait at the bottom of the Red Sea, that Yanbu alternative pipeline becomes instantly worthless.
Wow.
You can pump the oil to the Red Sea, but the ships can't get out into the Indian Ocean to reach global markets. They are stuck in a bathtub.
It's exactly like locking the front door of a bank during a robbery to keep the robbers out, only to realize someone just cemented the back exit shut.
That's exactly it. Everyone is trapped inside.
The only way oil is getting out is if ships take the incredibly long, dangerous, and expensive route around the Cape of Good Hope at the absolute bottom of Africa.
And as the shipping industry has repeatedly warned, there simply aren't enough tanker ships in existence to maintain global supply chains using that route.
And the U.S. ability to project military power into this specific area to stop the Houthis is severely constrained right now.
Look at the situation in Djibouti, which sits right across the narrow strait from Yemen. The U.S. operates Camp Lemonnier there, a massive, critical base for African and Middle Eastern operations.
But as of late February, the U.S. Embassy restricted access to the camp to mission-essential personnel only.
They're basically on lockdown.
They are on extremely high alert. And more importantly, the president of Djibouti has explicitly warned Washington not to use Djiboutian territory to launch offensive strikes against the Houthis.
Djibouti is walking a very delicate, precarious diplomatic tightrope. They have Chinese military bases there as well. They have European Union naval operations.
The U.S. cannot just assume they have free rein to use Djibouti as a launching pad for a new war in Yemen.
They are constrained geographically by the strait, diplomatically by their host nations, and militarily by the fact that their carriers are tied up at Kharq Island.
Which means there is an intense, frantic, behind-the-scenes diplomatic surge happening right now as we speak.
The U.S. State Department is almost certainly leaning heavily on Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Egypt.
Especially Egypt, whose entire national economy depends heavily on Suez Canal traffic, which would dry up if the strait closes.
And even Russia and China. The U.S. is desperately trying to leverage any back channel possible to convince the Houthis not to pull this trigger.
Because if Bab al-Mandeb closes, the U.S. loses control of the narrative, they lose control of the physical oil supply, and ultimately they lose the dollar.
That brings us to the ultimate sequence of events. Based on the intelligence reports and the economic data, the sources have broken down the immediate future into 3 critical flashpoints that will definitively resolve within the next 2 weeks.
Let's go through them. Flashpoint number 1 is the Kharq assault itself.
The forces are in position, the softening strikes are done, the intelligence is gathered.
The only remaining question is political timing. Does the administration order the 7,700 troops to begin the amphibious landing before or after the next major U.S. bond auction?
That's the billion-dollar question. They know that the very moment Marines hit the beach, the geopolitical shockwave will rattle the financial markets to their core.
Do they secure their financial funding first, risking a leak or a preemptive Iranian strike? Or do they secure the island first, risking a failed bond auction while the troops are under fire?
And that leads directly into flashpoint number 2, the Houthi decision.
The intelligence estimates suggest that the Houthis will make their move within 48 to 96 hours of a Kharq assault beginning.
The U.S. will have a terrifying window of 2 to 4 days to see if their frantic back-channel diplomacy worked, or if the Red Sea is about to become a fiery war zone.
And hanging over both the military assault and the Houthi reaction is flashpoint number 3, the Treasury liquidity event.
This is the bond market constraint coming to a violent head over the next 30 days. Because the Fed has already initiated precautionary quantitative easing, acknowledging the fragility of the system, the parameters of this event are highly volatile.
The sources outline 3 distinct, deeply researched scenarios for how the bond market reacts over the next month. Let's walk through them carefully, because this will dictate the survival of the U.S. economy.
Scenario 1 is the soft landing. The probability here is rated at only 15%.
So not likely. What does a soft landing look like?
In a soft landing scenario, the foreign central bank's selling of U.S. debt begins to naturally slow down. The yields on the Treasury bonds stabilize without spiking dangerously high.
And the Federal Reserve's preemptive money printing is absorbed quietly by the market without sparking a panic about inflation.
Right. In this 15% probability world, the bond market survives without visible trauma. The military operation proceeds without financial constraint, and the administration can declare that their grand strategy worked flawlessly.
But 15% is not exactly odds you want to bet the entire global economy on. That brings us to scenario 2, which is labeled controlled stress.
The sources give this a 55% probability, so statistically, this is the most likely outcome.
What does this look like in practice?
In a controlled stress scenario, the bond yields spike by roughly 30 to 50 basis points.
To put that in context, a basis point is 1/100%. So we are talking about interest rates jumping up to 0.5% very rapidly.
It doesn't sound like much to the average person, but on trillions of dollars of sovereign debt, it is a massive, crippling increase in borrowing costs.
Wow.
In this scenario, the Fed has to aggressively expand its QE program to buy more debt just to keep the system afloat. No single Treasury auction outright fails, but the trajectory of the U.S. financial system is visibly deteriorating.
It is highly costly, it is damaging, but it is technically survivable in the short term.
And then we get to scenario 3,
The break.
the break. The sources assign this a 30% probability, almost a 1 in 3 chance that the entire system buckles.
In this scenario, we see a failed Treasury auction.
Meaning the U.S. government tries to sell debt to fund itself, and there simply aren't enough buyers in the world willing to take the paper.
Or we see bond yields violently spike more than 100 basis points, a full percentage point, in less than 48 hours. The bond market ceases to function as a rational, liquid market, forcing the Fed to activate emergency draconian facilities far beyond conventional QE.
This is the cascade scenario. It leads to a fundamental, systemic loss of confidence in U.S. debt globally. It is the beginning of the end for the dollar's exorbitant privilege.
If we hit that 30% nightmare scenario, what is the actual trigger? What causes the dam to break so violently? We've talked about foreign selling, but what pushes it from a steady sell-off to an outright panic?
This raises an important question because it isn't just about the mathematical mechanics of bond trading. It's fundamentally about human psychology and market sentiment.
Okay.
The trigger for the break scenario is a shift in inflation expectations.
Let's unpack that. Explain how inflation expectations connect to a failed bond auction.
The global financial market is watching the Federal Reserve's every move. If the market concludes that the Fed is no longer managing the economy based on inflation data, but is instead just monetizing the national debt,
Literally printing money endlessly, simply to fund a military occupation of Kharq Island and prop up the petrodollar artificially.
exactly, the psychology shifts instantly from confidence to panic.
The market realizes the money is becoming worthless because the printing presses won't ever stop.
And when that realization hits, the inflation hedge trade explodes. Institutions, sovereign wealth funds, and central banks will dump dollars and treasuries simultaneously and aggressively buy hard assets.
The price of gold will rip higher at an unprecedented speed.
The U.S. dollar might see a brief violent spike as short sellers are forced to cover their positions, but then it will fundamentally collapse under the immense weight of the inflation expectations.
Which brings us to the grand finale of this timeline, the central strategic cliffhanger that the administration is currently facing. We have two massive, complex systems currently operating under extreme, unsustainable pressure.
Two races happening simultaneously,
Yeah.
and the clock is running out on both.
Which breaks first? The military campaign on the ground or the bond market in New York? Let's look at the failure conditions for both sides of this equation.
If the military fails first, if the Marines take too many casualties trying to hold Kharq Island under relentless rocket fire, or if the amphibious assault is somehow repelled, or if the Houthis successfully close the Bab al-Mandeb Strait and choke off the global energy supply,
The entire petrodollar strategy collapses instantly.
the United States loses its military credibility in the region, and dollar hegemony enters a permanent, irreversible death spiral.
The world moves entirely to the yuan and gold system because they have no other choice to secure energy.
But look at the other side of the coin. What if the military is succeeding, but the bond market breaks first?
If a treasury auction fails,
If yield spikes so violently high that the Fed loses total control? If that 30% break scenario hits? In that reality, the United States loses the fundamental ability to finance its own government.
and if the government cannot finance itself, the war stops. It doesn't stop because the Marines lacked courage or were defeated on the beaches of Kharq Island.
It stops because the Pentagon's checks bounce.
The United States simply cannot pay the immense daily costs to maintain the occupation and the supply lines.
The administration is clearly operating under the assumption that they can win both of these races. They genuinely believe they can secure military victory, establish total physical control over the Iranian oil flow, and reinstall the dollar toll booth before the bond market reaches the absolute breaking point.
But as we discussed at length today, the Federal Reserve's unprecedented decision to initiate precautionary QE suggests that the central bank absolutely does not share that optimism.
The Fed is preparing for massive collateral damage.
And that is exactly where the source material leaves us on this date, April 2, 2026. The lever is falling. The next few days will decide not just the fate of an island, but the financial architecture of the next century.
It is a phenomenal, albeit terrifying, breakdown of the mechanics driving this conflict.
It really is. But I want to leave you, the listener, with one final, lingering question. Something to mull over that goes beyond the immediate tactical movements and bond yields we've discussed today. Let's assume the administration achieves the impossible. Let's say they thread this impossibly narrow needle. The U.S. Marines seize Kharq Island with minimal casualties and manage to hold it against the artillery fire.
The Federal Reserve's emergency interventions hold the bond market together, preventing a catastrophic failure.
And somehow, frantic back-channel diplomacy keeps the Houthis from closing the Red Sea. The U.S. wins the military race and the financial race. They are standing victorious on Kharq Island, controlling the physical flow of oil and demanding that it be sold exclusively in U.S. dollars.
Okay, assuming all that goes perfectly.
Here is the question. What happens if the global south, the nations that have already spent the last year building the complex plumbing and infrastructure to trade in yuan and gold, what happens if they simply refuse to buy this newly U.S.-controlled dollar-denominated oil?
Wow.
You can use military force to secure a port. You can use financial engineering to shove a commodity into a specific currency wrapper. But can you use military force to make the rest of the world actually buy it?
That is the ultimate limit of hard power. You can control the supply with guns, but you cannot dictate demand in a truly multipolar world.
Keep a very, very close eye on the bond yields in the Red Sea over the coming days. Thank you for joining us for this EPIC deep dive. We will be watching the tape right alongside you.